What would you think if you found out that, in ancient Japan, the most beautiful and talented young boys were once bought and sold like rare treasures, becoming property of rich merchants and even powerful lords? History often tells us stories about graceful, stunning court ladies, but quietly leaves out a chilling truth. Male concubines also existed, and their lives were often far more tragic. These boys were not loyal servants or artists hired just for entertainment. They were young men forced into secret, intimate relationships with nobles, kept like living ornaments to satisfy their masters' desires. For hundreds of years, across many dynasties, their fate was hidden in the shadows, rarely written down, and almost never defended. If the velvet curtains of the palace and the lord's mansions were pulled back, what would you see? A society where beauty and talent could be priced in gold and silver, where pain and loneliness were locked behind music, fake smiles, and distant eyes of boys who never had a say in their own lives. While so many stories praise the glory of power, somewhere, in the background, these male concubines were forgotten, leaving behind only painful whispers under the cold moonlight.
On rooftops covered in moss.
And maybe the scariest thing is not being locked away, but being turned into a thing existing, never truly living. The story rarely begins in the grand halls of noble estates. It starts in small, mist-covered villages nestled among bamboo groves, where families cling to survival by the harvests of rice and fish. During the harshest winters or after seasons of famine and flood, desperation tightens its grip. For many poor families, the unthinkable becomes reality. Faced with starvation, they must choose between letting their sons waste away or selling them for enough rice to survive the next few months. In ancient Japan, sons were often seen as the pride of the family, hope for the future, a bearer of the family name. Yet, in times of crisis, a beautiful or clever boy could fetch a price far greater than any daughter. Wealthy merchants, noblemen, even lords, and members of the imperial court all sought after these rare living treasures, boys with delicate features, sparkling eyes, graceful movements, and quick intelligence. Their value was measured not just by strength, but by the combination of physical beauty and sharp mind. No one was surprised when, at dawn, a group of well-dressed strangers arrived at the village gate. Their manner was polite, their speech refined, but beneath their smiles was the cold calculation of those who trade in lives. These were the ningen, noha, the human teeth, professional scouts and brokers, who made a living by finding boys for the upper class. They asked questions quietly at first, then openly inspected children in the square, searching for the next perfect acquisition. The selection was harsh and humiliating. Boys, some barely 8 years old, were lined up like livestock for inspection. The scouts examined their teeth for health, their hands for dexterity, their skin for blemishes. They tested voices for clarity and looked for poise in every movement. Even a small scar could mean rejection. For those fortunate enough to be chosen, there was no celebration, only fear and uncertainty. Deals were struck quickly. In elegant kanji, few villagers could read set the terms, years of service, obedience, and absolute submission. Once the agreement was signed, events unfolded rapidly. A boy who had just kissed his mother goodbye would be led away, often never to return. For many, this was the last time they would ever see their home, their family, or hear their given names spoken with love. Those paper contracts, with their formal stamps and neat brushstrokes, held the weight of destiny. The boys were bound to serve in the mansions of samurai merchant families, or even the imperial palace for 10-15 years, sometimes longer if they pleased their master. During that time, every aspect of their existence, what they ate, how they dressed, even the thoughts they were allowed to express, was at the mercy of their owner's whims. Many never survived to see freedom. Illness, overwork, and violence took a grim toll. News of a boy's fate rarely returned to the village. Some parents waited years for word, clinging to hope. Others forced themselves to forget, comforted only by the coins they'd received and the knowledge that at least the rest of the family might endure. Those who lasted longer lost their youth, their innocence, and often their sense of self. Dazzling city lights and grand halls could not chase away the coldness of loneliness or the sting of shame. Each day was a silent battle for survival, not only of the body but of the spirit. Despite tales of rags to riches or miraculous turns of fate, the truth was far darker. Overnight, a child could become a living ornament stripped of their name, their memories, and their future. Society, for the most part, looked the other way. Among the upper class, to possess a beautiful young attendant was a symbol of status, like owning rare swords or priceless tea sets. In certain eras, an entire generation of boys could disappear from rural villages, their stories swallowed by the appetite of a system that valued human life as just another commodity. Perhaps the cruelest fate of all was left for those who stayed behind. Mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, learned to live with loss, a silence that lingered long after the scouts had gone. The great machine of tradition and hierarchy rolled on, indifferent to the dreams it destroyed, and so year after year, new boys were led away under the promise of a better life, only to have their youth and hope extinguished in the shadows of palaces and mansions. Their journey from cherished sons to living possessions marked the beginning of a tragedy that history would seldom dare to speak aloud. Once the deal was struck and the boy led away, from his village the true ordeal began, a journey not just across distance, but across the very boundaries of identity and selfhood. In the first moments at the gates of the estate or palace, everything familiar vanished. The names his parents whispered by the hearth were forbidden now, placed by poetic titles chosen by the master: Spring Willow, White Crane, or some other gentle-sounding phrase that served as both ornament and brand. Even his hair was cut and shaped according to the shifting fashions of court, while his coarse clothes from the countryside were burned or thrown away. In their place, the boy was wrapped in silk robes, beautiful and delicate, but alien on his skin, a constant reminder that he was no longer a child of his family, but property, a living decoration. The message was clear: his old life was gone. The transformation was enforced with a relentless authority. Any longing for home, any sign of rebellionters, a hesitation to bow, a word spoken too loud was met with swift punishment. Sometimes it was a slap or a night without food. Sometimes it was harsher, a humiliation carried out in front of others so that the lesson would sink in. Some boys tried to cling to their old selves, but the walls of the estate were thick and the routines designed to break down even the strongest resolve. It did not take long before most learned that submission, silence, and careful obedience were their only shield against cruelty. Yet the breaking of the spirit did not end there. Days began before the sun rose, with hours of kneeling, bowing, and practicing the most subtle rituals of etiquette. The boys were drilled in the high arts of the aristocracy. Each lesson meant not to educate for their own sake, but to mold them into perfect objects of pride and pleasure. They memorized court poems and learned to read and write with a brush until their hands ached. Their fingers practiced the koto or shamisen until their fingertips were sore, and their voices were trained for songs they'd never sing for themselves. They learned to move gracefully, to glide across tatami mats, to dance as if on invisible strings, all while wearing expressions of effortless serenity. Some were taught the intimate arts of tea ceremony or the proper way to prepare a bath, to mix herbal remedies or pour sake for important guests. A select few received lessons in calligraphy or the basics of mathematics, not for their own benefit, but to better serve or entertain their future masters. At times, the depth of their education surpassed that of many noble women, but this knowledge belonged to the estate, not to them. Each new skill was another piece of themselves surrendered, another brick in the invisible cage. All of this training was given and taken away with a system of rewards and punishments as old as the institution itself. A perfectly recited poem earned a rare sweet. A mistake during a performance could mean days of isolation or extra labor. Over weeks and months, the boys were conditioned to believe that their worth was tied solely to how well they pleased those in power. Smiles and praise could vanish in an instant, replaced by cold indifference or even cruelty. And beneath the careful routines, there was always the unspoken threat that failure, real or perceived, could mean a quiet disappearance. A boy simply gone one morning without a trace or even a whispered farewell. Loneliness was the uninvited companion to every lesson and every sleepless night. Some boys formed secret friendships, fleeting alliances forged in the dormitory darkness. They shared stories of their villages, comforted each other during punishments, and exchanged tiny tokens of memory. A pressed flower, a scrap of fabric, a word in their old dialect. But everyone knew these bonds could not last. A careless word or act could bring harsh punishment on everyone involved. And so the walls between hearts grew thicker with each passing season. Few survived the years of this transformation unscathed. The weak or unlucky often fell ill, some succumbing to exhaustion or despair. There were stories told in fearful whispers, boys who simply could not continue and were quietly buried in unmarked graves behind the garden, names erased and fates forgotten. The wind in the corridors sometimes seemed to carry those lost voices, faint lament carried through the halls of power. For those who survived, something essential was lost along the way. Their old selves, the laughter and innocence of childhood, the sense of home all faded beneath layers of silk, discipline, and silent endurance. They became what was demanded, flawless reflections of another's desires. Shadows in elegant robes, living artifacts who remembered only enough of their past to know it was gone forever. The making of a male concubine was not just the teaching of skill or the breaking of will. It was a systematic unmaking and remaking of the soul itself, carried out behind closed doors, away from the world's pity or judgment. And as the years went by, these boys became part of the palace itself, unseen, unacknowledged, but always present in the hush of the silken curtains and the silent glances that passed. Between master and servant, life inside the high walls of the palace or estate, despite all its shimmering beauty, was far from a reward for those who had survived the ordeal of transformation. If the outside world imagined a realm of endless feasts and gentle music, the reality within was a world of constant vigilance and invisible shackles. Each morning began before sunrise, the air heavy with the scent of incense and wet garden earth, as the boys, now companions in name, prepared themselves with meticulous care. The silk robes they wore, so admired by visitors, felt like uniforms for a silent army of captives in this closed universe. Every moment was governed by unspoken rules and the unpredictable moods of the powerful. There was no certainty, no steady ground to rest on. At any instant, a word or glance could change everything. A master's frown could turn a day into a nightmare, while a rare passing smile might offer a brief glimpse of hope or favor. The boys learned to read every gesture, every footstep, every whisper in the corridors. Their lives depended on it, but the greatest threat did not always come from their masters. Among themselves, the boys were set in constant, exhausting competition. For favor and survival, to be the favorite meant safety, better food, kinder words, perhaps even small freedoms. To fall from grace was to risk neglect or outright cruelty, starvation, humiliation, beatings, or, worst of all, being cast out with nothing. Friendships, though sometimes formed out of desperation, were always fragile, colored by jealousy and fear. Alliances shifted like the wind, and the pain of betrayal could be almost as sharp as the sting of a master's hand. The architecture itself reminded them of their ambiguous position. Their chambers, elegantly appointed with screens, tatami mats, and lacquered chests, were more like gilded cages than homes. The windows might offer views of cherry blossoms or moonlit ponds, but the doors were locked from the outside, and the paths through the garden strictly limited. Trusted servants kept a constant watch, ready to report any sign of disobedience or conspiracy. To outsiders, the boys seemed to move through a world of beauty and privilege. In truth, they lived under a relentless gaze, their freedom circumscribed by invisible lines drawn by the whims of others. As the days wore on, the stress of such a life began to carve deep grooves into their souls. Some boys became anxious and withdrawn, flinching at sudden noises or avoiding eye contact altogether. Others learned to mask their feelings, adapting the art of performance to their own survival. A smile at the right moment, a gentle joke, a well-timed poem. For a few, these acts became their only way to exert a small measure of control, to outmaneuver rivals, to curry favor, to earn tiny privileges that made life bearable. But for most, the never-ending uncertainty bred only paranoia and exhaustion. Illness was another silent enemy. Medical care, when provided, was crude and often indifferent. A fever, a lingering cough, or a twisted ankle might be ignored until it was too late. Those who became sick were seen as useless dead weight, easily replaced. The coldest reality was that no one grieved when a boy disappeared. A new companion would simply be brought in, the old one forgotten as quickly as a discarded robe. Occasionally, in the quietest hours of night, the boys would share brief moments of genuine connection. In whispered conversations after curfew, huddled beneath thin blankets, they told each other stories of home or confided their secret fears. Sometimes a flicker of hope passed between them, a dream of escape. A vow to remember one another's real names, a memory of a mother's song. But these fragile bonds were always under threat, and most withered in the face of punishment or betrayal. For all its outward splendor, life inside the palace was a careful, perpetual performance, one with stakes far greater than applause or disappointment. Every word, every gesture, every breath had to be measured. The cost of even a small mistake could be devastating, and the pressure to remain perfect grew heavier with every passing day. In this world, beauty was both blessing and curse, and even the softest touch could hide a knife. And so, surrounded by luxury, the boys lived each day balanced on the edge of hope and despair. Beautiful rooms, the elegant robes, the music that floated through the corridors, none of it could soften the truth that behind the curtain, life was a struggle to stay seen, to stay safe, and, above all, to somehow remember the echo of a self that the world had tried so hard to erase. But within the shimmering labyrinth of power, male concubines were never simply ornaments. To the world outside, they might have been seen as beautiful accessories. But inside the intricate web of court life, these young men became the soft weapons wielded by lords, nobles, and powerful merchants in their constant, silent wars. For advantage, their beauty, intelligence, and skill in reading the ever-shifting moods of the powerful gave them a place not just at their master's feet, but sometimes at their side in the most dangerous of games. In the imperial court, a favored companion could quietly tip the scales of politics, shifting the fate of entire families, clans, and even the course of a nation. Stories abounded whispered in the shadowed corridors of a single concubine's gentle word in the right. You're bringing about appointments, exiles, or even war. The closer one drew to the center of power, the greater the risks and the more treacherous. The ground beneath their feet, the annals of history tell of those whose meteoric rise seemed almost mythic. There was once a boy of rare grace and beauty, plucked from obscurity and brought into the heart of the palace while still in his teens. Within months, he became the confidant and cherished shadow of the young emperor, his laughter a balm in times of turmoil, his wisdom shaping the words whispered at dawn. The emperor's devotion became legend. In the story told again and again, the emperor, rather than disturb his beloved sleep, quietly sliced off the sleeve of his own robe. For a time, the boy was granted titles, lands, and a place above even the emperor's most trusted ministers. Yet power in the palace was always double-edged. Whispers of favoritism and manipulation bred jealousy and hate among the old guard. When the emperor died young, his grieving companion was left utterly exposed, stripped of title and protection. He faced accusations, public humiliation, and threats of torture until, finally, in a moment of despair, he chose to end his own life, vanishing from the world as abruptly as he had entered it. Nor was this a solitary tragedy. In other dynasties, in other palaces, rooms were set aside for the favorites of emperors' whole wings filled with laughter, music, and the scent of perfume, but also with secrets and dangers. A ruler who trusted his beautiful companions more than his seasoned advisors might let them weigh in on military matters or foreign alliances. At times, their influence led to disaster. Ill-fated campaigns launched on a whim. Fortunes wasted, peace shattered by a careless word. Outside the palace, wealthy merchants and ambitious officials used their own male treasures to curry favor or secure lucrative alliances. Sometimes, a handsome companion might be offered as a gift to a visiting dignitary or to win the loyalty of a rival. These boys became bargaining chips in negotiations that had nothing to do with their wishes or well-being. And always the higher a concubine's star rose, the greater the target painted upon his back. Jealousy, resentment, and political intrigue turned the palace into a chessboard with living pieces. Rivals plotted poisoning, false accusations of treason, or orchestrated disgrace. Some favorites were quietly removed, others met violent ends. Even those who survived for years lived with the constant knowledge that all it took was a master's. Boredom or the arrival of someone younger and more dazzling for everything to unravel. To fall from favor meant not just the loss of comfort, but often the loss of freedom, dignity, or even life itself. Through all this, the faces of the boys changed, but the patterns remained the same. Their fortunes rose and fell with the whims of power, and behind every story of dazzling ascent lurked a warning. The higher you were lifted, the further and more suddenly you could fall. For every boy who survived the shifting tides of favor and intrigue, time itself became the greatest enemy. Life as a male concubine was a race against the clock, a desperate attempt to cling to youth and beauty for just a little longer, knowing that every passing season hastened the end. By the time a companion reached his mid-20s, the glow of youth faded, replaced by a look of weary exhaustion that even the finest silks and powders could not hide. In a world obsessed with perfection, the smallest wrinkle, the first hint of age, was a silent sentence. Unlike their female counterparts, who might hope to secure a lasting place in the household through motherhood, the male concubine's fate was bound entirely to fleeting charm. There were no children to anchor him to his master's heart, no status to shield him from the inevitable. As new boys arrived, fresh-faced and unscarred by years of scrutiny, the old favorites were quietly set aside, sometimes with a word of thanks, more often with cold indifference. Abandonment brought with it a new kind of torment. Those discarded, no longer of use, often found themselves adrift and utterly alone. Few had any trade or skill beyond what they had been trained for. Fewer still had family or friends to turn to after years of isolation and secrecy. Many, unable to cope with the shame or loss, turned to opium or drink, chasing brief moments of oblivion in the haze. Addiction crept silently, robbing them of what little remained: health, dignity, and hope. Suicide was heartbreakingly common. A silent leap from a balcony in the rain, a body found floating in a lotus pond, a final bow before the darkness. Official reports labeled these tragedies as accidents or a sudden illness, quietly erasing any trace of scandal. Inside the palaces and behind the screens, physical abuse was simply part of the landscape. Beatings and humiliation, whether as discipline or entertainment, left scars that never fully healed. Medical care, when offered, was primitive at best. Illness or injury could mean a slow, lonely death, ignored by those who once delighted in the boy's beauty and wit. Even among survivors, few lived to old age. Most were cast out, wandering the streets as shadows, dying of hunger or sickness. In alleyways, their bodies consigned to unmarked graves. Their names were rarely spoken again. Yet the suffering did not end with the boys themselves. Far away, in the villages where these sons were born, their families wrestled with guilt and sorrow. The silver coins received in exchange for a child's future were often spent arranging marriages for daughters or staving off starvation for another year. Mothers and fathers whispered comforting lies to themselves that perhaps their son had found happiness, that his sacrifice had saved them all. Beneath these hopes, shame festered, a wound that could never quite heal. Society, too, played its part in this quiet tragedy. Everyone knew, yet few spoke. The pain of these boys and the burden of their families were hidden behind silk screens, buried beneath polite conversation in the unyielding march of custom. The history of male concubines faded from memory, tucked away in the corners of forbidden records. Their lives reduced to footnotes or forgotten entirely. Thus, The legacy of these lost sons lingered as a silent IK warning and a plea for compassion. Buried under centuries of silence and secrecy, the tragedy of these forgotten boys. Their suffering, swallowed by silk curtains and centuries of silence, lingers like a question we cannot ignore. What is the value of a human life? Their stories, when we dare to look closely, reveal a dark and recurring pattern: how entire societies can blind themselves to cruelty when it serves the powerful, wrapping exploitation in the language of tradition and virtue. In ancient Japan, as elsewhere, even those entrusted with morality, Confucian scholars, Buddhist monks, noble lords, and emperors preached about compassion, wisdom, and family, all while upholding a system that turned children into property. Hypocrisy was not merely personal, but woven into the very fabric of culture. The poetry that once praised the gentle grace of a favored boy masked a deeper violence. The elaborate ceremonies that celebrated beauty and refinement drew a curtain over loneliness, abuse, and loss. 8. It was easier for society to ignore the pain, to let the machine keep turning, than to face the uncomfortable truth that suffering, when hidden behind enough gold and silk, can be normalized, even admired. And yet, this is not only a story of the past. Today, in distant cities and quiet villages, the trade in human lives continues, sometimes in the open, more often in the shadows. Children are still sold for survival. Labor is still extracted from the vulnerable under the guise of necessity or tradition. Modern laws and values promise protection, but loopholes and silence leave many still trapped. Their stories echoing those of the lost concubines from long ago. The forgotten boys of the palaces remind us that progress is never automatic. That every generation must choose to see or to look away, to speak out or to remain silent. Their lives call out not for pity, but for honesty and action. They urge us to question the stories we are told, to pierce the facades of respectability and comfort, and to recognize the quiet suffering that can exist beneath even the most beautiful surfaces. Let us not allow their memory to fade once more into silence. By remembering these voices, by acknowledging the reality of what was done to them, we take the first step toward honoring their dignity, toward ensuring that no one, now or in the future, is ever again reduced to a mere possession. Their legacy is a warning and a hope that in every era, in every place, the measure of our humanity is found in how fiercely we protect one another's right to live, to dream, and to be free.